The waiting room outside the courthouse smelled like industrial cleaner and broken dreams. Sarah Mitchell swung her legs rhythmically against the plastic chair, her small sneakers barely grazing the linoleum floor beneath her. At 3 years and 4 months old, she possessed a sadness that seemed incongruous with her tender age. Her pale blue eyes, the same shade as her father's, noted painfully, stared blankly at an outdated television mounted in the corner, its volume muted, its screen flickering with a children's cartoon that failed to capture her attention. Beside her, Mitchell gripped her granddaughter's small hand firmly, as if the physical connection alone could anchor Sarah to safety and security. Had been a teacher for 40 years before her retirement, and she prided herself on her ability to read people, to understand what lurked beneath surface behavior. What she saw in Sarah terrified her beyond measure. The child had changed dramatically over the past 8 months, transforming from a vibrant, curious toddler into a withdrawn shadow of her former self. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It had been gradual, incremental, like a slow fade to black that nobody noticed, until the room was completely dark. It started with small things. During their weekly visit 6 months ago, Sarah would run to Scar, chattering endlessly about her day. Now she barely smiled. Her eyes had a haunted quality, as if she was constantly bracing for something terrible to happen. The weight loss was noticeable too. Her little cheeks had hollowed out, and her ribs were beginning to show through her thin shirts. Had gently mentioned this to her daughter, but was met with dismissive responses. "She's just going through a picky eating phase," had said, waving her hand dismissively while checking her phone. All kids do that at this age. But knew better. She'd raised 3 children of her own and had spent 4 decades observing the subtle signs of neglect and emotional distress in children. She'd watched Sarah's confidence crumble. The little girl who once sang loudly and danced unself-consciously now spoke in whispers, as if afraid that raising her voice might trigger anger. She flinched when people moved too quickly near her. She had developed a nervous habit of biting her cuticles until they bled. These were not the behaviors of a child, simply going through a phase. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening 2 months ago. Had stopped by Sarah's apartment unannounced, something she rarely did, respecting her daughter's privacy. What she found would haunt her forever. Sarah was alone in the apartment, sitting in the dark living room surrounded by empty takeout containers and scattered clothes. The air smelled stale and unwashed. Sarah wore a diaper that clearly hadn't been changed in hours, and her hair was matted and dirty. When Sarah saw her grandmother instead of running to her with joy, the child simply sat there, vacant and unresponsive. Hands had shaken as she cleaned her granddaughter up, changed her diaper, and fed her a proper meal. When finally arrived home at midnight, reeking of alcohol and perfume that wasn't her own, confronted her directly. The argument that followed had been explosive. Insisted she'd only been gone for a few hours, that Sarah was fine, that was overreacting and being judgmental. She accused her mother of trying to make her look bad, of harboring resentment about lifestyle choices, but had seen the truth in Sarah's empty eyes. This wasn't occasional neglect. This was a pattern. Had become consumed by her social life, her new boyfriend, her parties that extended into the early morning hours. Sarah had become an inconvenience, an obstacle to her mother's pursuit of pleasure. Over the following weeks, documented everything meticulously. She photographed the bruises on Sarah's arms, bruises claimed came from falls, but which suspected came from rough handling or being grabbed in anger. She recorded dates and times when failed to pick Sarah up from preschool, leaving the school staff scrambling to reach family members. She noted the concerning behavioral changes, Sarah's regression in toilet training, her new tendency to have accidents when frightened, her increasingly violent outbursts followed by complete emotional shutdown. A pediatrician friend, after examining Sarah during an unofficial visit, expressed serious concern about signs of emotional trauma and possible physical abuse. The decision to call Child Protective Services hadn't come easily to. She loved her daughter despite flaws. She knew that involving authorities would damage their relationship irreparably, but she loved Sarah more. She couldn't stand by and watch her granddaughter suffer. On a cold November morning had made the call. She spoke to a caseworker named David, describing Sarah's condition, the neglect, the concerning behavioral changes, and her fears for the child's safety. Her voice had shaken as she provided her name, knowing that she was essentially reporting her own child to authorities. The CPS investigation that followed was thorough and devastating. They conducted surprise home visits, finding the apartment in squalid conditions. They interviewed neighbors, who reported hearing Sarah crying for extended periods while her mother was absent. They spoke to preschool teachers, who noted Sarah's malnourishment and emotional distress. They examined Sarah's medical records, which showed delayed development and signs of nutritional deficiency. A child psychologist assessed Sarah and documented significant trauma indicators for a child so young. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Now, sitting in this waiting room, watched Sarah's profile, noting how the little girl's jaw clenched and unclenched with anxiety. Today was the custody hearing. Today, a judge would decide whether Sarah would remain with her mother or be placed in protective custody. Had prepared herself for any outcome, though she desperately hoped that the court would recognize the gravity of the situation and act in Sarah's best interest. Sarah suddenly squeezed hand tightly, her small fingers trembling. "Grandma," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "is Mommy here?" His heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. Even now, even after everything, Sarah was worried about her mother, afraid she might be angry. This was the reality of what neglect and emotional abuse did to a child. It twisted their thinking, made them blame themselves, made them cling to the very person hurting them. "Yes, sweetheart," whispered back, kissing the top of Sarah's head. "Mommy is here, but today we're going to talk to a very important judge who wants to make sure you're safe and happy." Sarah nodded solemnly, gripping her worn teddy bear, the only possession she seemed to truly treasure. As they were called to enter the courtroom, prayed silently that justice would prevail, that someone in that room would see what she saw, would understand what this precious child had endured, and would have the wisdom and courage to save her. The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom creaked open with a sound that seemed to echo through Sarah's entire body like a warning bell. A court officer in a crisp blue uniform gestured for and Sarah to enter, and they stepped across the threshold into a cavernous space that suddenly felt impossibly large and impossibly hostile. The courtroom was designed to intimidate. High ceilings with ornate crown molding, dark wood paneling that absorbed light rather than reflecting it, and an elevated judge's bench that positioned authority literally above everyone else. Every surface seemed designed to remind visitors that they were entering a place of serious judgment and consequence. Sarah's small hand gripped, with the desperation of a drowning child clinging to driftwood. The little girl's eyes darted nervously around the room, taking in the sea of unfamiliar faces. There were lawyers in expensive suits, court reporters with their recording devices, spectators sitting in observation chairs, and various court officials moving about with practiced efficiency. To a 3-year-old, it must have seemed like an alien world, cold, incomprehensible, and deeply frightening. Judge sat elevated behind the imposing bench, and her presence immediately commanded the entire room's attention. She was a woman in her early 60s, with steel-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, piercing gray eyes that seemed to see through falsehoods, and a bearing that suggested she had spent 15 years cutting through deception and protecting the vulnerable. Her reputation in family court was legendary. Attorneys who appeared before her spoke of her meticulous attention to detail, her refusal to tolerate dishonesty, and most importantly, her unwavering dedication to child welfare above all other considerations. She had never been reversed on appeal in a custody case. She had never been accused of bias. She was, in many ways, exactly the judge a case like Sarah's needed. On one side of the courtroom sat Mitchell, Sarah's mother. She wore a tasteful navy blazer and pressed white blouse, an outfit clearly chosen for courtroom presentation rather than her typical style. Her hair was professionally styled, her makeup applied with careful precision. She sat rigid in her chair, her jaw clenched so tightly that her facial muscles seemed strained. Beside her was her attorney, a smooth-talking lawyer known for aggressive tactics and questionable ethics. He whispered something too, who nodded sharply, her eyes fixed on Sarah with an expression that was difficult to read. Was it love, anger, fear? Sarah seemed unable to decipher her mother's expression either, and this uncertainty clearly intensified her anxiety. On the opposite side of the courtroom sat David, the social worker who had been assigned to Sarah's case. He was a man in his mid-40s with kind eyes and an air of profound concern. He had been reviewing his case file, thick with photographs of bruises, medical reports, behavioral assessments, and witness statements from teachers and neighbors. His expression was grave and worried, the weight of responsibility clearly visible on his face. He would be the primary witness for the state's position, that Sarah needed immediate protection from her mother's care. The court clerk, a gray-haired woman who had worked in family court for 2 decades, solemnly read the charges against Mitchell: willful neglect of a minor child, failure to provide adequate nutrition and hygiene, emotional abuse, and failure to ensure proper supervision. Each charge landed like a hammer blow, and his lawyer immediately objected to the phrasing, arguing that the language was prejudicial and inflammatory. Judge sustained some objections and overruled others with economical efficiency, her decisions swift and final. Sarah was guided by a victim advocate, a gentle woman named Tors, toward a small chair positioned at an angle so that she could see the judge without being directly exposed to everyone in the courtroom. Had worked with traumatized children for 15 years and moved with practiced calm, attempting to project safety and competence. But nothing could fully prepare a 3-year-old for this environment. Sarah's entire body was trembling. Her breathing had become shallow and rapid. Her eyes were wide with a terror that broke his heart. Judge leaned forward slightly, her expression softening marginally when she looked at Sarah. "Hello, sweetheart," she said, her voice gentler than her stern appearance suggested it could be. "My name is Judge. Do you know why you're here today?" Sarah shook her head mutely, unable to speak. Her bottom lip began to quiver. "We're here because we want to make sure you're safe and happy," the judge continued. "I'm going to ask you some questions and I want you to tell me the truth. Is that okay?" Sarah nodded, though she clearly didn't understand what this meant or what was being asked of her. She remained silent, her small fingers picking anxiously at a loose thread on her pink dress. Attorney stood abruptly. "Your Honor, I must object to this proceeding. The child is clearly too distressed and emotionally unstable to provide reliable testimony. This is psychological abuse, forcing a traumatized child to perform for the court." Judge's eyes narrowed. "Counsel, you'll have your opportunity to make arguments. Sit down." The tension in the courtroom was palpable now, almost suffocating. The judge's gaze swept across the room, assessing everyone present. She seemed to be making a decision, weighing options, considering protocols. Sarah continued to sit in her small chair, completely overwhelmed, unable to speak or move. "Before we proceed," Judge announced, "I want to implement additional protections for this child's emotional well-being during these proceedings. The witness appears to be in significant distress, and we have an obligation to minimize psychological trauma while still gathering necessary information." She turned to Officer Johnson, who stood near the courtroom door in his crisp police uniform. "Officer Johnson, I believe you have a certified comfort animal with you today. Bring the dog in, please. Let's see if that helps settle the child." Attorney immediately began to object, but Judge silenced him with a look that could have frozen lava. The judge had made her decision, and everyone in that courtroom knew better than to argue further. All eyes turned toward the door as Officer Johnson disappeared briefly, returning moments later with a presence that would change everything about the proceedings that were about to unfold. The courtroom doors swung open, and Officer Johnson returned, but he was no longer alone. Walking beside him, moving with the calm and measured pace of a creature completely unaware of the gravity of the situation surrounding him, was Duke, a 3-year-old golden retriever, whose shimmering coat seemed to catch and reflect the fluorescent courtroom lights like spun gold. Duke was a large dog, weighing approximately 70 pounds, but he carried himself with a gentleness that seemed to diminish his size. His dark brown eyes were intelligent and kind, and his entire demeanor radiated a peaceful competence that appeared almost otherworldly in the sterile, tension-filled courtroom. The moment Duke entered the room, a subtle shift occurred. The courtroom energy transformed, not dramatically, but noticeably. Observers who had been sitting in tense silence began to relax slightly. Even some of the attorneys stopped their frantic note-taking to glance at the dog. His lawyer began formulating objections, but he paused, seemingly uncertain of his footing. Judge watched carefully, her expression unreadable but her eyes following Duke's every movement with the intensity of a chess master studying the board. But the most dramatic change occurred in Sarah herself. The little girl's eyes, which moments before had been fixed on the floor in paralyzing fear, suddenly lifted. They widened with wonder, and for the first time since entering the courtroom, her rigid shoulders relaxed fractionally. Her breathing, which had been rapid and shallow, slowed slightly. It was as if the appearance of this golden creature had somehow reset her nervous system, offering her brain a different focal point than the overwhelming terror of the courtroom environment. Officer Johnson guided Duke towards Sarah's chair with practiced ease, clearly having done this many times before. As they approached, Duke's tail began to wag gently, not with the frantic enthusiasm of an untrained pet, but with measured, controlled movements. Everything about Duke's behavior suggested he understood exactly what was required of him. He had been trained extensively for this exact scenario, had worked with hundreds of traumatized children, and possessed an almost supernatural ability to sense what each individual child needed. When Duke reached Sarah's chair, he did something that seemed perfectly calibrated to her emotional state. Rather than jumping up or trying to climb into her lap, which would have startled her, he simply and deliberately rested his large head gently on her thigh. His chin was positioned comfortably on her lap, his nose pointing toward her chest, his dark eyes looking up at her with an expression that seemed to communicate complete acceptance and unconditional presence. Sarah froze. For a long moment, she didn't move. Her small hand hovered in the air between her body and Duke's head, as if she wasn't sure whether contact was permitted. Tears began streaming down her face, not tears of fear, but tears of a different quality entirely. They were the tears of a traumatized child encountering kindness in a place she had expected only more pain and confusion. Her small hand descended slowly and made contact with Duke's head, her fingers threading gently through his silken fur. The transformation was almost instantaneous and absolutely remarkable. Sarah's entire body, which had been wound tight as a coiled spring, seemed to release its tension. Her breathing deepened and normalized. Her jaw, which had been clenched so tightly it looked like it might crack, relaxed. The trembling that had plagued her from the moment she entered the courtroom diminished significantly. She continued stroking Duke's head, her small fingers running through his golden coat with increasing confidence and tenderness. Judge watched this interaction with careful attention, noting every nuance of Sarah's changing demeanor. This was precisely what she had hoped for, a bridge of connection, a path from fear to stability. She glanced briefly at David, the social worker, who was visibly moved by what he was witnessing. He was taking detailed notes, understanding that this moment, Duke's calming effect on Sarah, would be crucial evidence in the proceedings ahead. Attorney stood abruptly, his face reddening with indignation. "Your Honor, I must object to this highly irregular and prejudicial procedure. Introducing an animal into these proceedings is inappropriate and potentially contaminating to any testimony this child might provide. The defense moves that any statements made by the child in the presence of this animal be deemed inadmissible as they cannot be as voluntary or uninfluenced. Judge's eyes fixed on the attorney with the cold intensity of a predator focusing on prey. "Counsel, sit down, now." The attorney sat, but his jaw remained clenched, and his fingers drummed anxiously on the table. He was clearly uncomfortable with the direction these proceedings were taking, and his discomfort was entirely justified from his perspective. He understood, as all good attorneys do, that emotional responses in courtrooms could sway judges and juries, and Sarah's obvious comfort with Duke presented a problem for his case. Judge turned her attention back to Sarah and Duke. "Officer Johnson, what is this dog's name and what are his qualifications?" Officer Johnson stepped forward, his voice professional and clear. "This is Duke, Your Honor. He's a certified therapy and assistance dog, specifically trained to provide emotional support to traumatized children during legal proceedings. He's been certified by the International Association of Canine Partners for Assistance, and he has over 200 hours of specialized training. He's worked in courtroom settings for 3 years and has been involved in approximately 400 child custody and abuse cases. His presence has been documented to reduce cortisol levels, the stress hormone, in children by up to 60% within minutes of contact. He's completely non-aggressive, has never shown any behavioral problems, and is vaccinated and health certified annually." Judge nodded thoughtfully. "Thank you, officer. The court finds that Duke's presence is appropriate and potentially beneficial to this child's emotional stability during testimony. The record will reflect that the dog's purpose is solely to provide emotional comfort and stabilization, and any objections regarding the admissibility of testimony based on the dog's presence are overruled. This is not an extraordinary or prejudicial measure. It is a reasonable accommodation for a traumatized child." Attorney looked like he wanted to argue further but seemed to recognize the futility of doing so. Judge had made her ruling, and that was final. Meanwhile, Sarah had become completely absorbed in her interaction with Duke. She had even managed a small, tentative smile, the first genuine smile anyone in the courtroom had seen from her. She was humming quietly, an almost unconscious gesture of contentment. Her entire body language had transformed from defensive and terrified to open and slightly more peaceful. "I think we're ready to proceed," Judge announced. "Sarah, honey, I'm going to ask you some questions now. Duke is going to stay right with you, okay? You can pet him whenever you want. Just remember to tell me the truth about what happened at home. Are you ready?" Sarah looked up from Duke's head, her tear-stained face showing a fragile courage that seemed to come from the dog's steady, calming presence. She nodded slowly, and Officer Johnson positioned Duke's leash so the dog could remain close to Sarah while still allowing her some mobility. The stage was now set. A traumatized 3-year-old girl, surrounded by the support of a specially trained dog, was about to reveal the secrets of her suffering, secrets that would ultimately reshape her entire life. Judge leaned back slightly in her chair, her posture assuming a more gentle configuration than before. She understood that extracting testimony from a 3-year-old required extraordinary patience, specific communication techniques, and an almost theatrical sensitivity to the child's emotional state. She had prepared for this moment, reviewing child psychology literature and consulting with pediatric psychologists about the most effective ways to elicit truthful statements from very young children without leading them or implanting false memories. "Sarah, sweetie," the judge began, her voice deliberately soft and unhurried, "I want to ask you about your home. Where do you live?" Sarah's fingers continued their gentle motion through Duke's fur, and the dog responded by leaning slightly into her touch. The simple question seemed to activate something in Sarah's consciousness, a shift from paralyzed fear to cautious engagement. She opened her mouth, closed it, then tried again. "I live with Mommy," Sarah whispered, her voice so quiet that the court reporter leaned forward to ensure the microphone captured her words. "In the apartment." "That's good," Judge affirmed gently. "And does Mommy take care of you there? Does she make sure you have food to eat? Sarah's body went rigid for a moment. This seemingly innocent question had touched something raw and painful. Her hand paused in Duke's fur and her lower lip began to tremble. Duke, sensing the shift in her emotional state, lifted his head slightly and nudged Sarah's hand gently, as if reminding her that he was there, that she was safe, that she could speak her truth. Sometimes, Sarah said quietly, her eyes fixed on Duke's face rather than looking at the judge. Not always. Can you tell me about the times when Mommy doesn't have food? Judge asked, her tone remaining patient and neutral. What happens then? Sarah was quiet for a long moment. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath, waiting for the words that might determine her fate. Sitting in the observer section, was gripping the armrest so tightly her knuckles had turned white. David was taking careful notes, his expression grave and focused. My tummy hurts, Sarah finally said, her voice trembling. And I ask Mommy for food, but she say she busy. She say to go play or watch TV, and I go to bed hungry, and my tummy hurts more. Attorney stood abruptly. Your Honor, I object. The child is clearly being coached or is providing responses based on leading questions. This testimony is inadmissible as it lacks reliability and authenticity. Judge's expression hardened into something that resembled stone. Counsel, I will warn you once. The question posed was open-ended and non-leading. The child is providing answers in her own words, using vocabulary and phrasing consistent with a 3-year-old. Your objection is overruled. Sit down. The attorney sat, his face flushed with anger and frustration. He recognized that he was losing ground, that the judge had already formed preliminary judgments that favored the child's welfare over his client's interests. Sarah, the judge continued, when Mommy is busy and you're hungry, where is Mommy? What is she doing? Sarah's answer came more quickly this time, as if once she had begun revealing her truth, the dam had broken. Mommy with her friends. They talk loud, they laugh. Sometimes they sleep. I watch TV in my room. I watch TV a long time. My eyes hurt, but I watch TV. How long is a long time? The judge asked, carefully avoiding a leading question while still seeking clarification. Like all day, Sarah said. And when it dark outside, Mommy still not come, and I scared of the dark. Judge exchanged a meaningful glance with David. This description aligned perfectly with the documented evidence in the case file. Neighbors had reported hearing a television blaring for extended periods, sometimes throughout entire evenings and nights. There were also reports of Sarah showing signs of sleep deprivation and developmental concerns consistent with inadequate supervision and stimulation. Sarah, you said you're scared of the dark, the judge continued. Why are you scared? Sarah buried her face partially in Duke's neck, and the dog responded by tilting his head to rest against hers, a gesture of comfort that was almost heartbreakingly tender. When Sarah spoke again, her voice was muffled but still audible. Because Mommy get angry in the dark. She yell, she throw things. One time I go to bathroom in night and she push me. She push me hard and I fall, and she say bad words. The courtroom erupted into barely suppressed reactions, gasps, muttered comments, the sound of someone crying quietly in the observer section. Judge rapped her gavel once sharply, demanding silence and order. His face had gone completely white and her attorney was frantically making notes, clearly preparing counterarguments. Did Mommy hurt you other times? The judge asked, her voice now carrying an edge of steel beneath its surface gentleness. Sarah pulled one of her small arms out from Duke's fur and held it up, revealing the faded bruises that had documented so carefully in photographs. The bruises were yellowish now, healing but still visible enough to be undeniable evidence of physical contact. Sarah pointed to each mark without speaking, as if the visual evidence was sufficient explanation. Can you tell me how you got these bruises? Judge asked. Mommy grabbed me, Sarah said simply. When she angry, she grab my arm hard and she shake me. She say I bad, she say I make her crazy. Attorney attempted another objection, but Judge cut him off with a gesture. I've already ruled on this line of questioning. Sit down. Judge spent the next 40 minutes systematically drawing out details of Sarah's daily experience. Sarah described days of unsupervised television viewing, meals that rarely came at predictable times, bathrooms that were often filthy, clothes that went unwashed. She described her mother's boyfriends, transient men who came and went at irregular hours. She described the fear she felt when her mother left the apartment, the terror of being alone, the way her heart would race every time she heard a noise. Most damaging to his case was Sarah's answer when Judge asked, "Do you feel safe at home with Mommy?" Sarah looked directly at the judge for the first time, her small face serious and achingly mature. "No," she said simply. "I don't feel safe. I feel scared all the time. I scared Mommy mad. I scared I be alone. I scared I hungry. I scared." David was openly crying now, his professional detachment shattered by the raw honesty of a 3-year-old's pain. Several people in the observer section were also openly weeping. The power of Sarah's unvarnished testimony, her simple, heartbreaking descriptions of neglect and fear, was undeniable and absolutely devastating. Throughout the entire proceeding, Duke remained a constant presence, his fur occasionally dampened by Sarah's tears, his steady breathing and calm demeanor serving as an anchor for the traumatized child. When Sarah's voice trembled, she would reach for the dog. When anxiety threatened to overwhelm her, Duke would lean into her. The dog had become more than a comfort animal. He had become a translator, helping a frightened child find the courage to speak the truth that would ultimately save her life. Judge paused, allowing the weight of Sarah's testimony to settle over the courtroom like a heavy blanket. She removed her reading glasses and set them carefully on the bench, then rubbed her eyes as if to clear away the emotional exhaustion of hearing such devastating revelations from such a young child. The judge had presided over hundreds of custody cases, had heard countless stories of parental neglect and abuse, but something about Sarah's simple, unvarnished honesty struck at the core of her commitment to child protection. She took a deep breath, collected her thoughts, and prepared for what she believed would be the final series of questions. "Sarah, honey," Judge began, her voice gentler than before, "I have one more important question for you. If you could have anything in the whole world, anything at all, what would make you the happiest? What would make you feel safe and loved?" The question hung in the air, seemingly innocuous, almost like something a therapist might ask during a routine session. But Judge had formulated this question with precision and intention. She wanted to hear from Sarah herself what she needed, what her instincts told her would bring her peace. She wasn't asking about material possessions or toys. She was asking about the deepest longings of a wounded child's heart. Sarah was silent for an extended moment. Her small hand continued stroking Duke's fur, and her eyes were distant, as if she was searching through the landscapes of her memory for an answer. The courtroom waited with palpable tension, observers leaning forward slightly, attorneys poised with pens ready to take notes. Then Sarah did something unexpected. She raised her small hand and pointed directly at Duke, but her eyes had shifted away from the dog. She was looking at something, or someone, beyond the physical animal in front of her. Her pointing gesture seemed to indicate something larger, some concept or person or feeling that Duke represented to her. "I want my daddy," Sarah said, her voice suddenly stronger and more clear than it had been throughout the entire proceeding. "I want my daddy. He like Duke. He protect me. He love me." The courtroom erupted. Hands flew to her mouth in shock. Her attorney's pen clattered to the table, forgotten. Gasped so loudly that several people turned to look at her. Judge's eyebrows raised fractionally, the only indication that she too had not anticipated this particular revelation. But it was David's reaction that was most notable. The social worker's entire body went rigid. His face paled. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping back with a loud noise. "Your Honor," David said urgently, his voice trembling, "I need to show you something. I just discovered this information last week." Judge gestured for him to approach the bench. David practically rushed forward, fumbling in his leather briefcase and extracting a thick manila folder. He whispered something urgently to the judge, his hands gesticulating with growing agitation and distress. Judge's expression shifted from curiosity to shock to something that resembled controlled anger. "Counsel," the judge said sharply, addressing both attorneys, "approach the bench, now." The attorney stood reluctantly, clearly bewildered and potentially panicked. David's attorney, a younger woman representing the state's interest in Sarah's welfare, approached with obvious confusion but also a glimmer of hope in her eyes. The three attorneys and David huddled around the judge's bench, their voices too low for the courtroom observers to hear, but the animated body language made clear that something seismic had just shifted. Throughout this exchange, Sarah sat quietly with Duke, seemingly unaware of the chaos her simple words had unleashed. She had released the truth she'd been holding, and now that truth was ricocheting through the courtroom like a bullet finding its mark. After several minutes of intense, whispered conversation, Judge rapped her gavel sharply. "We will take a 15-minute recess," she announced. "All parties will remain in the courtroom. No one is to leave. No one is to contact anyone outside this courtroom. Court officers secure the entrances." Began crying, her shoulders shaking with what might have been sobs of realization or despair. Her attorney was frantically flipping through documents, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. Squeezed her hands together, her eyes searching for understanding of what had just transpired. During the recess, David finally revealed what he had discovered. Apparently, while conducting routine background checks and reviewing old court documents related to Sarah's case, he had stumbled upon a sealed motion filed approximately 18 months ago. The motion was from someone named James Mitchell, requesting visitation rights and custody consideration for a child named Sarah Mitchell. The file notation indicated that the motion had been filed, received, and then systematically blocked through a series of legal maneuvers by family members. This discovery had been shocking enough, but what followed was even more astonishing. David had then pulled additional court records and discovered 17 separate motions filed by James Mitchell over an 18-month period, each requesting contact with Sarah, each one systematically blocked or delayed. Bank records showed consistent child support payments. Employment records showed James maintained stable employment. Character references from his employer indicated he was a reliable, trustworthy individual. Most damning of all, David had accessed security footage from a local park, footage provided by the city in response to a standard child protection inquiry. The footage showed a man consistently appearing at the park over a 6-month period, always on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, always sitting on the same bench, watching the playground with an expression of profound longing. The man in the footage appeared to be in his late 20s, had dark hair, and occasionally left small wrapped packages on the bench or nearby, gifts that were sometimes collected and sometimes left behind. "Your Honor," David explained to Judge during the recess, "I believe this man in the footage is James Mitchell, Sarah's biological father. And I believe the reason Sarah just asked for her father, the reason she said she wants someone to protect her, is because, at some unconscious level, she remembers him. She remembers being loved by him before her mother systematically removed him from her life." Judge's expression was grim. She immediately instructed court officers to locate James Mitchell and bring him to the courthouse immediately. She also issued a directive for a comprehensive investigation into why Sarah's father had been systematically blocked from contact with his daughter, and which family members had been involved in this interference. When the recess ended and court resumed, Judge made an announcement that sent shockwaves through the room. "The record will reflect that new information has come to light regarding the biological father of the minor child. It appears that Sarah's father, James Mitchell, has been actively seeking custody and contact with his daughter for an extended period, and that said contact may have been deliberately obstructed by other family members. This court is now ordering an immediate emergency investigation into these circumstances. Additionally, I am issuing a temporary protective custody order, removing Sarah from her mother's care effective immediately, pending further investigation and hearing. Began sobbing uncontrollably. Her attorney tried to argue, but the judge silenced him with a look. The momentum of the case had shifted entirely, pivoting from a straightforward neglect case into something far more complex, a mystery of parental alienation and family interference that would require complete unraveling. As Sarah sat with Duke, seemingly unaware that her simple words had just transformed everything, Judge made a decision that would alter the course of justice itself. She ordered that James Mitchell be brought to the courthouse as quickly as possible. She wanted to see this man who had been fighting for his daughter, who had apparently never stopped loving her, who had been systematically kept from her by forces within her own family. The truth, Sarah had just taught everyone in that courtroom, had a power that transcended courtroom procedure and legal maneuvering. Sometimes, all it took was one honest 3-year-old girl, the comfort of a specially trained dog, and the courage to speak one's deepest longing to topple an entire structure of lies. The investigation that commenced immediately following Sarah's courtroom revelation was unlike anything the family court system in that jurisdiction had seen in recent memory. Judge, recognizing the gravity and complexity of what was unfolding, had appointed a special investigator, a seasoned professional named Detective Richardson, who had spent 20 years investigating complex family law violations and custodial interference cases. Richardson arrived at the courthouse within 2 hours, carrying with her the methodical determination of someone who had dedicated her career to uncovering hidden truths. The first phase of the investigation focused on James Mitchell himself. Richardson needed to establish a timeline of his attempts to contact Sarah, to understand who he was as a person, and to determine whether he posed any risk to the child or whether he had genuinely been blocked from access through deliberate interference. What she discovered was simultaneously heartbreaking and infuriating. James Mitchell, age 28, had been employed continuously at construction company for the past 4 years. His employment records showed he was a foreman, a position of significant responsibility, and that his employer considered him one of his most reliable and valued employees. His supervisor, a man named Robert, was immediately contacted by Detective Richardson, spoke without hesitation about James's character, describing him as one of the most dedicated people I've ever employed. He's never missed a day, shows up early, takes on extra responsibilities without complaint. If he has a daughter, I have no doubt he's an excellent father. The man has integrity written all over him. More significantly, the financial records told a compelling story. James had been making consistent child support payments of $600 per month for the past 3 years, payments made through the court system, automatically deducted from his paycheck. The payments had never been late, never been missed, never been disputed. $600 per month represented a substantial commitment from someone earning a working-class wage. It was money he had sacrificed from his own modest lifestyle to support a daughter he had been prevented from seeing. But the most crucial discovery came when Detective Richardson accessed the sealed motion files from the courthouse. What emerged was a documented pattern of legal obstruction that bordered on criminal. James's initial custody motion, filed 18 months ago, had been met with legal resistance from his mother, a woman named Gray, who had hired an attorney to argue that James was unfit and uninvolved. The irony was staggering. Gray had spent significant money, hired legal representation, and undertaken substantial legal maneuvering to keep James away from Sarah, all while he was actively seeking contact and contributing financial support. The documentation showed that every time James filed a motion, and he had filed 17 in total, he had provided evidence of his employment, his stable housing, his participation in parenting classes, his completion of anger management counseling, and his ongoing financial commitment. Yet each motion had been systematically blocked, delayed, or buried in procedural complications. At one point, James's attorney had filed an expedited hearing request that had been mysteriously lost in the court system for 3 months. "It's a deliberate campaign of custodial interference," Detective Richardson explained to Judge, her voice tight with controlled anger. "Someone, likely Gray, possibly with knowledge and cooperation, has been systematically using the legal system to block this man's access to his daughter. And the courts, in their bureaucratic inefficiency, allowed it to happen." The next phase of investigation focused on security footage and witness testimony. Detective Richardson obtained surveillance footage from Riverside Park, the location where James had apparently been secretly visiting his daughter. The footage, spanning 6 months of twice-weekly visits, showed a man matching James's description sitting on the same bench every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon between 2 and 3 o'clock. In the footage, this man, later confirmed to be James, watched the playground with an expression of profound longing and sadness. He never attempted to approach the children directly. He simply sat, watched, and occasionally left small wrapped packages on the bench beside him. When the packages were traced, they revealed an extraordinary pattern of paternal devotion. Christmas gifts, a small stuffed animal, a picture book, a child-sized winter jacket. Birthday presents, a musical toy, new shoes in the correct size for a growing 3-year-old, a blanket embroidered with alphabet letters. School supplies, crayons, coloring books, educational games. Each gift was thoughtfully chosen, age-appropriate, and clearly selected with knowledge of what a 3-year-old child would enjoy and need. The playground staff had been interviewed, and their testimony was devastating to the case. Multiple employees reported seeing the same man week after week, always maintaining a respectful distance from the children, never attempting inappropriate contact, simply watching with the expression of someone experiencing profound heartbreak. One playground attendant, a woman named Maria Santos, became particularly emotional during her interview. "I saw that man so many times," she told Detective Richardson, tears streaming down her face. "And I could see the love in his eyes. He never did anything wrong. He never tried to take any child. He just watched. And sometimes he would look so sad that it broke my heart. I always wondered who he was waiting for, who he was missing so badly." The investigation also revealed evidence of James's attempts to build a proper home for his daughter. Detective Richardson discovered bank records showing that James had been saving money aggressively. Over the past 2 years, he had accumulated nearly $30,000, money earmarked for a down payment on a house. He had enrolled in a homeownership program through a nonprofit organization. He had taken out a library card specifically to borrow parenting books. He had attended every parenting class offered in the county. He had even begun therapy to address unresolved childhood trauma, recognizing that becoming a healthy father would require him to heal his own wounds. Most damning of all, Detective Richardson uncovered communications, text messages and emails, between Gray and discussing how to keep James out of the picture. One email from to stated explicitly, "We cannot allow that man to interfere with our family. Once you're settled with someone new, Sarah won't even remember her biological father. We'll handle this legally to ensure he stays away." Another email exchange revealed that had deliberately avoided listing James's contact information when registering Sarah for preschool, had instructed family members not to inform James of Sarah's address or whereabouts, and had specifically instructed preschool staff to deny James any information about the child if he ever inquired. The legal implications were staggering. What had appeared to be a simple case of a negligent mother had transformed into something far more complex, a case involving systematic parental alienation, deliberate interference with custody rights, and what amounted to custodial kidnapping. James had never abandoned Sarah. He had never failed to support her. He had been systematically and deliberately kept from her by people who had access to the legal system, and the resources to weaponize it against him. When James Mitchell was finally located and brought to the courthouse, he was accompanied by his own attorney, a public defender named Susan Williams, who had been astonished by the evidence of her client's efforts and devotion. James was visibly nervous, confused about why he was being summoned to court. He had no idea that his daughter had just revealed his existence, had no idea that the walls of interference and obstruction were about to come crashing down. As James sat in the courtroom, waiting to understand what was happening, Detective Richardson presented her findings to Judge. The evidence was overwhelming. Not only had James never abandoned his daughter, he had been a model father in every way possible despite the systematic interference that had kept him from her. He had financially supported her, sought legal contact, attempted to build a stable life for her, and apparently had been maintaining silent, distant contact through park visits and left gifts. The investigation had uncovered not just a truth, but a profound injustice. A man who had loved his daughter from afar, fighting against a system that had been weaponized against him, waiting and hoping for the day he might be allowed back into her life. And now, finally, that day had arrived. Judge sat in her chambers for nearly 2 hours following Detective Richardson's presentation of evidence. Her law clerk, a sharp young woman named Jennifer Park, had organized the findings into clear categories: financial records, legal documents, surveillance footage, witness testimony, and investigative conclusions. The evidence was so overwhelming, so devastating to his case and so vindicating of James's character, that found herself struggling with the emotional weight of what she was reviewing. She had presided over hundreds of custody cases, but she had rarely encountered a situation where the injustice had been so profound, so deliberate, and so systematically perpetrated through abuse of the legal system itself. The judge also reviewed her own courtroom notes from Sarah's testimony. The child's simple words echoed in her mind. "I want my daddy. He like Duke. He protect me. He love me." Those words, spoken by a traumatized 3-year-old who had been deliberately kept from her father, seemed to carry the weight of profound truth. Sarah had reached beyond the confusion and fear of her immediate circumstances to grasp the deepest longing of her heart, the longing for her father, a man she barely remembered but whose love had somehow transcended the barrier of deliberate separation. When court reconvened, the atmosphere in the courtroom was electric with anticipation. Word had spread through the courthouse about the explosive nature of the investigation. Observers who had left during the recess returned, sensing that something momentous was about to occur. Sat rigidly in her chair, her face ashen, her attorney whispering urgently beside her, clearly recognizing that the case had shifted in ways that were catastrophic to their position. Judge entered from chambers, and her expression was grave, the expression of someone about to render judgment that would have profound consequences for everyone involved. She settled herself at the bench and opened the thick folder containing her findings and prepared ruling. "This court has reviewed extensive evidence," Judge began, her voice carrying through the courtroom with the authority of someone delivering justice. "And I must say that in my 15 years of presiding over family law matters, I have rarely encountered a situation of such egregious parental alienation and systematic interference with custody rights." She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle. "The evidence clearly establishes that James Mitchell has not abandoned his daughter. Rather, James Mitchell has been systematically prevented from contact with his daughter through deliberate interference by family members of the child's mother. James Mitchell has maintained consistent financial support. James Mitchell has sought legal contact through proper channels on 17 separate occasions. James Mitchell has maintained employment, completed required counseling, and built a stable home environment. James Mitchell has even, at considerable personal sacrifice and emotional cost, maintained distant contact with his daughter through means that did not violate the obstructive orders that had been imposed against him." Began crying, her body shaking with sobs. Her attorney placed a hand on her shoulder, but she seemed barely aware of his presence. Furthermore, the judge continued, the evidence establishes that the child, Sarah Mitchell, has been subjected to serious neglect by her mother, Mitchell. The child has not been provided adequate nutrition, supervision, emotional support, or physical care. The child has been exposed to inappropriate environments and has suffered emotional trauma as a result of her mother's negligence and abuse. Judge removed her glasses and looked directly at Mitchell. You have failed in your most fundamental responsibility as a mother. You have neglected your daughter's basic needs. You have exposed her to inappropriate situations. You have actively worked to deny your daughter contact with her father, a man who has demonstrated consistent love and commitment to his child. Your actions have caused serious psychological harm to a vulnerable 3-year-old child. The judge turned her attention to James, who sat forward in his chair, his entire body trembling with barely contained emotion. James Mitchell, this court finds that you have acted with integrity and dedication in your efforts to maintain a relationship with your daughter despite systematic obstruction. Your character, your employment history, your completion of required programs, and your consistent financial support all speak to your fitness as a parent. Judge then delivered her ruling with unmistakable clarity. It is therefore the order of this court that primary custody of Sarah Mitchell is hereby awarded to James Mitchell, effective immediately. Mitchell shall receive supervised visitation only, contingent upon her completion of a comprehensive rehabilitation program addressing substance abuse, parental neglect, and psychological issues. The court further orders that Mitchell shall continue to pay child support in the amount of $300 per month, as determined by state guidelines. This custody arrangement shall remain in effect until further order of this court. The courtroom erupted. Some observers cried openly, others exchanged stunned glances. His attorney was urgently speaking to his client, who appeared to be in shock, unable to process what had just occurred. News photographers who had been allowed into the courtroom were furiously taking pictures. But the most transformative moment was about to occur. Judge made an additional order. Court officers, bring the child into the courtroom. I am permitting the child to reunite with her father immediately. Sarah was brought into the courtroom by Tors, the victim advocate who had been with her throughout the proceedings. The little girl was confused, her eyes searching the unfamiliar faces for something she could understand. She still clutched Duke's leash. The dog had been allowed to remain in the courthouse during the recess, a decision that would prove providential. Sarah, honey, Judge said gently, do you see that man over there? She pointed toward James, who had stood when Sarah entered, his eyes fixed on his daughter with an intensity that contained years of longing, frustration, love, and hope. Sarah looked in the direction the judge had indicated. For a moment, nothing happened. Then something shifted in Sarah's expression, a flicker of recognition, as if some deeply buried memory was surfacing. Her small body went rigid. And then she ran. She didn't run toward the judge or toward the courtroom exit. She ran directly toward James, her small feet moving as fast as her little legs could carry her. Gasped from the observer section. Officer Johnson stood, his hand over his heart, visibly moved by what was unfolding. James dropped to his knees just as Sarah reached him, and he caught his daughter as she launched herself into his arms. Sarah's entire body collided with his, and she began sobbing, deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to contain all the fear and confusion and loneliness of her young life. James held her as if she might disappear if he loosened his grip even slightly. His own face was wet with tears, his shoulders shaking as he wept for the lost time, for the pain his daughter had endured, for the joy of finally being able to hold her. "Daddy," Sarah sobbed into his chest. "Daddy, daddy, daddy." "I'm here, sweetheart," James whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm here, I'm not going anywhere, I'm here." Duke, sensing the emotional magnitude of the moment, walked over to the reunited father and daughter and gently rested his head on James's shoulder. The image was so powerful, so achingly beautiful, that even Judge seemed unable to look away. A 3-year-old girl had been restored to her father. Justice had been served. And in that moment, the entire courtroom witnessed the power of truth, the strength of paternal love, and the transformative capacity of a system designed to protect the most vulnerable among us. Sat in her chair, abandoned by her attorney, watching the reunion with an expression that seemed to contain a terrifying mixture of jealousy, regret, and the dawning realization of what she had lost through her own choices. Wept openly, relieved and grateful that her brave granddaughter had finally found her way home. Judge rapped her gavel once, quietly, marking the official end of the proceedings. "Court is adjourned," she announced. "May God bless this child and her father." As officers processed the paperwork and the courtroom began to empty, James remained on his knees, holding his daughter, while Duke stood guard beside them, a golden sentinel bearing witness to one of the most profound moments of justice and redemption that Courtroom would ever see. 6 months had passed since that transformative day in Judge's courtroom. The small house on Maple Street, a modest 2-bedroom cottage with a fenced yard and a front porch that caught the morning light, had become a sanctuary of healing and hope. James Mitchell stood in the doorway of his daughter's bedroom, watching Sarah as she sat at a small wooden table, her tongue protruding slightly in concentration as she colored a picture of a golden dog. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny spirits celebrating the child's recovery. Sarah's transformation had been nothing short of remarkable. When she first arrived at James's home that evening after the courthouse reunion, she had been withdrawn and anxious, her nervous system so attuned to fear that any sudden sound or movement caused her to flinch. James had moved slowly, spoken softly, and allowed her to set the pace for their reunion. He had prepared her bedroom with meticulous care, soft pastel walls, age-appropriate books, toys that encouraged creativity and exploration, and most importantly, a shape like the moon that cast a gentle glow, ensuring she would never have to experience the suffocating darkness that had terrified her. The first week had been challenging. Sarah had nightmares, waking screaming in the darkness despite she would have episodes where she couldn't eat, her stomach too twisted with anxiety to accept nourishment. She would cry for no apparent reason, her tiny body releasing months of accumulated trauma. But James had been patient, loving, and absolutely committed to helping his daughter heal. He had taken a week off from work, remaining constantly present, allowing Sarah to see that he would not disappear, that he was reliable, that she was safe. A child psychologist specializing in trauma, Dr. Maria, had been working with Sarah for the past 5 months. The progress had been steady and heartening. Sarah's nightmares had decreased significantly. Her appetite, initially almost non-existent, had improved dramatically. She was gaining weight and growing stronger. Her vocabulary had expanded, and she was able to express emotions with increasing sophistication. Most importantly, her capacity for joy had returned. She laughed now, genuinely and unself-consciously. She played with abandon. She asked questions about everything with the natural curiosity of a child whose fear was no longer consuming all her emotional energy. James's employment situation had transformed as well. Robert, his construction company supervisor, had been so moved by James's custody case that he had promoted him to project manager, a position with increased pay, benefits, and flexibility. Had even allowed James to adjust his schedule to accommodate Sarah's preschool pickup and regular therapy appointments. The workplace community had embraced James and Sarah's story, brought welcome gifts. The company had created a college savings fund for Sarah as a gesture of support. James had gone from merely surviving to actually thriving, his talent and dedication finally recognized and rewarded. The most visible and cherished aspect of Sarah's new life was her continued relationship with Duke. Officer Johnson had kept his promise to visit monthly, bringing Duke to their home for extended. These visits had become sacred events in Sarah's calendar. She would count down the days, creating drawings of Duke, making dog-themed crafts, preparing special treats. When Duke arrived, Sarah would launch herself at the dog with unrestrained joy, hugging him and laughing with abandon. These monthly visits had evolved into something more significant. Judge, moved by the profound impact of Duke's presence on Sarah's testimony and recovery, had initiated a comprehensive program to expand the use of comfort animals in family court proceedings throughout the state. Officer Johnson had been appointed as the coordinator of this newly funded initiative. The program, named Duke's Law in honor of the golden retriever whose gentle presence had changed everything, had been implemented in 17 courthouses across the state. Specially trained therapy dogs were now available for traumatized children, providing testimony in custody and abuse cases. The impact had been immediate and measurable. Judges, social workers, and child advocates reported that children more fully and honestly when accompanied by trained comfort animals. Prosecutors noted higher conviction rates in abuse cases. Psychologists documented reduced trauma responses in children who had testifying with support dogs present. Duke had become something of a celebrity, featured in multiple news stories and professional journals. He had even been recognized by the state legislature, with a formal resolution honoring his service to vulnerable children. His journey had been more complicated and heartbreaking. She had enrolled in a comprehensive rehabilitation program that required her to address her substance abuse issues, her pattern of parental neglect, and the underlying psychological issues that had led her to deliberately interfere with James's custody rights. The program was intensive, demanding, and often painful. During the first month, had relapsed, returning to substance use before forcing herself back into recovery. She had attended group therapy sessions where she heard stories from other parents who had lost custody of their children, and each story had added weight to her understanding of what she had done to Sarah. After 4 months of consistent treatment, had achieved 90 days of sobriety. She had participated in parenting education classes, individual therapy sessions, and family counseling with a court-appointed therapist. Her supervised visitations with Sarah had progressed slowly but steadily. The first visit had been awkward and painful. Sarah was wary and confused, not fully understanding why her mother had hurt her or why she was now only allowed to visit under supervision. But over the months, had worked to rebuild a relationship with her daughter from the ground up, approaching each visit with humility and commitment to her daughter's rather than her own needs. Sarah's grandmother had become an integral part of the healing process. She visited regularly, bringing meals James hadn't had time to prepare, offering support and presence, and most importantly, helping Sarah understand that family could be trusted and safe. Had also been essential in helping James navigate the practical aspects of single parenthood, school registration, medical appointments, developmental milestones. The 3-generation family that had been fractured was slowly becoming whole again. Judge had used Sarah's case as the basis for a comprehensive law review article published in the Journal of Family Law. The article, titled Justice Through a Child's Eyes, Systemic Reform in Response to Custodial Interference, had become required reading in family law courses throughout the country. Had also been invited to present at judicial conferences nationwide, advocating for systemic changes to better protect children from custodial interference and to improve how courts handled testimony from traumatized young children. On a Saturday morning in late May, 6 months after the custody hearing, Sarah stood in her father's living room wearing a new dress James had bought her. She was preparing for a milestone event, her preschool graduation. She had flourished in her school environment, showing remarkable social and academic progress. Her teacher, Mrs. Richardson, had reported that Sarah was among the most engaged and joyful children in the classroom, beloved by her peers for her kindness and infectious enthusiasm. James knelt beside his daughter, straightening her dress and brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "Are you excited?" he asked. Yes, Sarah exclaimed, bouncing slightly. And Grandma coming, and Officer Johnson coming with Duke. They're all coming, sweetheart, James assured her. Everyone who loves you will be there to celebrate how amazing you are. That evening, the small school gymnasium was filled with parents, family members, and guests. As Sarah walked across the makeshift stage to receive her graduation certificate, the audience erupted in applause, was crying tears of joy. Officer Johnson sat with Duke on a specially designated mat, the dog's tail wagging gently as if he understood he was witnessing a momentous achievement. And in the back of the gymnasium, Judge sat quietly, observing the triumph of a child who had found her voice and in doing so had transformed an entire system. Sarah stood at the microphone, encouraged by her teacher to say a few words about her experience in preschool. Her small voice, steady and clear, carried through the gymnasium. I'm grateful for my teacher, Mrs. Richardson, Sarah began, reading from a card her father had helped her prepare. I'm grateful for my grandma. I'm grateful for my daddy who loves me very much. And I'm grateful for Duke because Duke helped me when I was scared. Duke helped me tell the truth. And now I'm happy. The gymnasium erupted in applause. James, standing near the back, had tears streaming down his face. One small girl's courage had literally changed a system, rewritten the rules of justice, and inspired a nation to rethink how it protected its most vulnerable citizens. Sarah Mitchell, a 3-year-old who had pointed at a police dog and spoken truth to power, had become the unlikely catalyst for systemic transformation. As Sarah descended from the stage and ran into her father's arms, as Officer Johnson patted Duke's head in recognition of their shared mission, as Judge nodded with quiet satisfaction at the victory of justice, everyone understood that this child's story was not simply one of personal redemption. It was a story about the power of truth, the strength of parental love, the capacity of the system to reform itself when confronted with injustice, and most importantly, the remarkable resilience of children when given safety, love, and someone willing to listen to what they have to say.